This is Canon Fodder, episode 25. We are live in the frozen north of Russia and also live on Twitter. Astral, how you doing, my friend?
What's up, man? Thanks for having me on. This has been a long time coming.
Oh, most definitely. All right. Let's actually get to Twitter, right?
All
I'll let
right.
you do a brief intro to our listeners and we'll get to it.
All right. So, for the people listening to TR's podcast, just so they know, I have my own podcast, the Astral Flight Simulation, and I record some of my episodes live on Twitter. So, if you listen to my show, you can follow me on Twitter at ASTRALFLITE. And not only come listen, because some of these episodes end up on my Substack for paid subscribers. You come listen for free live. You can also join in. You can ask questions. You can contribute, and then you can hear yourself on a podcast someday because they eventually all come out for free. So here
And
we go. Oh, go ahead.
I'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes. Definitely your Twitter, your podcast, and maybe even a schedule of your
Yeah, man.
future
Thank you.
spaces.
Thank you. And you're coming on mine soon.
Oh, most
So
definitely.
for the listener, we are now going live on Twitter, and we'll be recording both together. But if you're not on Twitter with us right now, you're missing out on the live recording. So make sure you follow both of us and the Double Dealer, and you can get in on these for free live. So here we go, live on Twitter. Hey, I am here with TR Hudson and the Double Dealer for a live podcast collaboration between the Astral Flight Simulation and the Double Dealer podcast, Double Dealer magazine. And we're going to talk about Crime and Punishment and Dostoevsky tonight. Go ahead, TR.
Thank you, Astral. This is episode 25 of Canon Fodder. We're doing Crime and Punishment, obviously, because I know Astral to be one of the best voices in this sphere on literature, especially on Dostoevsky. Uh, I've done 25 of these. I've got a bunch of more episodes lined up. A couple of guests, future guests, are in the chat right now. Hey, Athenian. So check us out on our Substack. The Double Dealer magazine also has physical copies of our magazine for sale on Amazon. If you like this show, if you like, the stuff that we put out, give us a follow, buy a magazine. Really appreciate it.
The farthest I'll go in accepting that compliment is to say that I'm extremely enthusiastic about the literature and the authors I like. So I'm proud and grateful that people. There is literally a Twitter anon calling me on my real phone right now. How does he not know I'm doing this? I won't say who it is, but unfortunately, when that happens, it cuts into the audio on the Twitter space. TR, can you hear me on the Twitter space?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. You're coming in hot.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah. Well, I won't give up. I won't give up who I give my real phone number to, but that was an anon who should know that I'm here because I invited him. But anyway, where were we? Go on. What were we saying? That threw me off.
So I guess the first place that we can start with Crime and Punishment is the context of where Dostoevsky's writing from, what he's trying to get across in this novel, as well as the situation in Russia at the time. This is a time of great social upheaval, I'd say, and I think you sent me so many notes, which has just been a treasure trove of information to discuss this book. And one of the things that Raskolnikov is, I guess you could say, is he is a social striver. He's kind of a provincial. He comes to St. Petersburg to be an intellectual, to be a man of consequence, a man of history, and he has all these ideas, mostly imported from France. And I'm throwing a lot of darts out here for the listener out here, so that we can pick them up later in more detail. But Raskolnikov, he's coming to St. Petersburg to study, and he's filled with all these ideas that man can make his own value judgments, that he can make his own values, and he eventually comes to the conclusion, much like Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov, that anything is permitted, including murder, including the most heinous crimes, once you realize that your values are kind of made up by yourself.
Yeah, so okay, so to back up and to come to Raskolnikov, the character of Raskolnikov. Now, I presume typically when you talk about Dostoevsky, he's one of the most widely read authors in history. Um, so when you talk about him, you're typically talking to people who've read his work. But in some cases, there are people who are interested in him but haven't read him. So I'm not going to belabor certain obvious things too much. But to lead up to what TR is talking about, the way I understand this novel is kind of in two contexts, the historical and the literary context. So this is a novel of psychological realism, and the sources that I read about literature basically credit Dostoevsky for inventing the genre of psychological realism. At least he took it into like the modernist novel. He was the first like modernist novelist to do the psychological realism. So realism was a reaction. It was a literary form that was a reaction to romanticism. And it came later in Russia. I mean, everything came later in Russia than it did in Western Europe. So the realist novel came later than it did in France, and the romantic novel came later than it did in France. The romantic novel is basically considered like the establishment or the perpetuation or the the expression of newly created bourgeois values. So in the romantic novel, now Pushkin is like the romantic Russian. So he was like one of the biggest authors prior to Dostoevsky. He was considered the romantic novelist. And St. Petersburg was like the city of the romantics. It was like this newly created modern city. So they had all these expectations for St. Petersburg to be this like utopia, for lack of a better word. Maybe that's a little bit too strong of a word, but the idea is that like the new Russia is going to take place in St. Petersburg, and they're going to get away from the old values, and they're going to come into the new middle class, newly created bourgeois values. But the problem is that Russia was still like an autocracy, and it was still like an empire. I hesitate to use that word with Russia because the Soviet Union came along, and when you think of the Russian Empire, that's what you think of. But they still had a lot of influence throughout the 19th century abroad. Um, and by the time Dostoevsky came around, a lot of those like expectations and a lot of that optimism had sort of faded. Um, and a lot of the old ways, the conservative things about Russia, like the staunch religion, but even more important than the Orthodox religion was the autocratic state, which had like complete control over like everything. And they also had serfdom. So the landlords were like the next tier under the state, under the czar, really, that controlled everything. So throughout the period of romanticism, like they were expecting the czar to bring them into the future and to like to realize all these like bourgeois values and this modernization, because France had just undergone the revolution and modernization. Democracy and industrialism and capitalism was like ruling Western Europe. But through the period of romanticization, which is when the realist period started in France in like the 1840s, right? The literary movement, I mean to say. Um, Through all that, Russia was still very powerful and still very optimistic, and it still had a strong sense of itself. And then the Crimean War happened, and they lost. And it was not just a terrible loss, but it was also one that like they didn't really accept. So all through the Romantic period, there were all these pushes for modernization and liberalization, and like they wanted to like democratize the economy and stuff like that, and democratize politics, democratize the press, everything. After the Crimean War happened and they lost, they really like lost their standing in the rest of the world, and they kind of like they literally lost their fleet in the Black Sea. So like their actual power had been like greatly diminished, and also their sense of themselves, their impression of themselves had been like uh, kind of dashed on the cobblestones of the St. Petersburg walkways. So as the reforms started to come in, right, the czars started to do all these liberalizing reforms. Dostoevsky comes along, and the reforms are like picking up all these ideas of this like newly created intelligentsia, which also came in around like the 1840s, which is like when I said France had already transitioned from like romanticism to realism. It was actually even earlier than that in France. So like, 25 years had already gone by. So all through this time, they're like reading French newspapers and reading French literature. They're reading Western uh, intellectual ideas. And the most important one here is like J.S. Mill and Bentham, the utilitarians. But there was all these French socialists like Proudhon and obviously Marx and Engels. Well, they're not French, but they're Western Europe. But Proudhon was this really important French radical thinker that most people now forget about because he's kind of historically irrelevant because Marx overshadowed him. But he's important to Dostoevsky in this novel, and I'll explain why later. By the time Dostoevsky came around and started writing Notes from Underground, all of this agitation of these like new ideas and these like liberal reforms actually, which had been floating around in Russia. I mean, and that's Dostoevsky's term. These ideas were floating around in Russia. They'd been floating around for 20, 25 years or longer. They actually now started to be implemented into like the social order. All these like education reforms, reforms of the military, reforms of politics, all this. The serfs got freed. The military became like a more of a like you had to be. You were like forced into the military if you were a serf before, and you had to serve 25 years. But now you only had to serve 6 years. So this is a well-known way to like enfranchise people, like either to make them like citizens or to give them like benefits of the state. They serve the military and then they get out and they become these like free citizens who can go on and do whatever. It got shortened to 6 years. So this was a way for like the serfs to like become a new middle class. It was creating a new middle class, which is what Romanticism was supposed to be. But Dostoevsky foresaw all like the problems that he thought all these new ideas would bring. There was all these people who didn't want to free the serfs because they thought it would cause all this social upheaval, unrest, which is why Proudhon is important. Because Proudhon is somebody who was saying that like there needs to be land reform in France where all the peasants are like given an equal partition of land. And people in Russia knew about this. They knew about this guy's ideas. And they didn't want that to happen because they weren't good stewards of the land. And it was a way for but even besides that though, there was also a way for them to like take power away from the aristocracy and to take power away from the landlords and the landed classes. So they were worried that this tension between land reform and what the serfs want, because the serfs in Russia were actively agitating for land reform, so they would be given the land that they were working, and they weren't given the land that they were working, but they were agitating for it. So in France, there was a revolution in 1848. There's big riots and revolutions all throughout France. And this was just one of the many things that Russians saw happen in Western Europe that they didn't want to have happen here. Now, I could go on and on and on about this because it goes through all facets of society. But I hope you get the idea at this point. So the realist novel comes in where instead of showing this like clean, vibrant city, this new city where all these new people are wearing their fresh clothing and they have their great loving relationships between each other and their romantic relationships, and they make their new friends and they have all this intellectual stimulation and everybody goes on to be happy and it's this prosperous thing. Dostoevsky shows the underbelly. He shows the dark side. He shows the slums. He shows the prostitutes. He shows the drunks. He shows the predators. He shows the victims of the predators. You see animals being beaten to death in the street. You see people committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide. So it's a portrayal of slum life. The woman he murders, the book is famous for like, he murders a pawnbroker. It's an old lady and she has like a retarded sister that he kills. So it's this like lecherous old woman. At the same time, Raskolnikov in his head has all these new ideas, right? That are this whole modernization process that I'm talking about. The very ideas that the state was implementing to like reorganize their entire society around it. So Dostoevsky is doing a double critique here of saying like, look, like your modernization process like isn't this like beautiful shining thing that everybody's like, saying that it's going to be. This is the dark underbelly. Uh, at the same time, this book is meant as a warning, and he starts all this in Notes from Underground, by the way. Notes from Underground is supposed to show, it's a psychological novel that's supposed to show the poverty of these ideas, and that if someone were to really like, but the thing is Notes from Underground, the underground man is critiquing and satirizing all this stuff, and he's like, he adopts his own like cynical egoism, but he's also like critiquing rationalism and like making fun of it, and he's satirizing it and he's parodizing it. Whereas here, Raskolnikov actually accepts all these ideas and he takes them up, and he says that like the rationalization and the utilitarianism, these ideas that Russian intellectuals got from Western Europe, they said that they should use to like create a new morality to base their society around. Raskolnikov actually embodies all this stuff and truly believes it. He accepts them. He tries to implement them in his life, and he tries to like find success or prosperity through using these new ideas. And it's a complete and utter disaster. So that's the context, and that's the way I understand this novel. That's like the setup. But I assume you want to talk about a little bit about the plot, at least what he does with the ideas and what happens to him at the end.
Most definitely, and I could co-sign on all of that. I would want to bring up the immense psychological damage that happened to Russia as a result of the Napoleonic War. Yes, it's a war that Russia won in the end, right? But at great cost. Moscow is burned to the ground, and also you have the entire French, or sorry, not French, Russian aristocracy. The Russian court was based on the French court. Peter the Great modeled St. Petersburg, which is where this novel takes place, after the great European cities. This was Russia was trying to become a European power. It was trying to make advances with Europe. You have and actually, when it comes to the Crimean War, the fact that they lose to the Turks, who were the enemy of Europe for the longest time, while also having to fight Europe, Europe allies with the Turks against the Russians. That's one of the reasons that the Russians lose. You have this. Not only do you have the Russian state kind of in disarray over this, but the Russian people themselves, they're like, our society has been faced towards Europe for so long, and yet they want nothing to do with us. In fact, they're our enemies. They would rather ally with the Muslim Turks than to see Russia have any sort of power in the region.
Yeah, this is great that you bring that up, because I said all that and I never even mentioned the name Napoleon. And Napoleon is very important to Raskolnikov, the character himself. Yeah, so excuse me. Yes, Napoleon as a figure was seen differently to them because they like defeated him and they chased him out and they chased him all the way back across Europe. Um, and also the Turkish war that you're talking about. The thing is when they lost the Crimean War, they lost their fleet, and they also had like stewardship over all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And I don't exactly know how that played out in the ground, but that was one way for Russia to like exert its influence outside of its borders. When they lost the Crimean War, they lost that, so their influence was greatly diminished. And then the Turkish War, from what I read, it was a series of Russian victories militarily, but it was still a diplomatic loss. And England came in, and perhaps France as well. Definitely. Did you say France? I can't remember, but definitely England came in and forced them to sign some embarrassing treaties that where they effectively lost the war. So the point is that like the Russian consciousness at that point, like they were having to like reevaluate themselves. They were have to like reevaluate their relationship to themselves and their relationship to the world outside and to Western Europe. And Napoleon is an important figure because Raskolnikov is a provincial. So this follows like the standard, like what we know as like the novel, like the form of the novel, the modern novel at the time was the idea of a provincial man who was like lower class, or not an aristocrat necessarily, and definitely not rich, and he definitely wasn't part of high society. He comes from the provinces, and he moves to a city that is like newly enriched, and it's like newly booming, and he tries to make it in this new world of new values and new types of people and new social mores, more money, more social standing, and you can kind of like move up the hierarchy or the social ladder, so to speak. And there's a bunch of examples of this. It's pretty common through English and French novels, but the one that comes to mind for me is The Red and the Black by Stendhal, which is explicitly mentioned as an influence on this book. There's several others, but Julian Sorel goes to the city and he wants to become like a playboy, and he gets embroiled in all these affairs, and he ends up it ends up as a tragedy. He ends up committing a murder, which is exactly what Raskolnikov does, but he does it in a much, much different way. Raskolnikov comes to the city, and instead of like ingratiating himself into like high society and trying to like climb the social ladder that way, he goes to college, and it has to be emphasized here. This is, painfully obvious in the novel, but if you haven't read the book, it needs to be stressed that he's like barely hanging on by a thread financially. He's in poverty. He lives in what Dostoevsky refers to as a closet. It's really just big enough for his bed. He wears rags. He's dressed in rags all the time. He's starving. His sister has to be betrothed to a man whose dowry she's using to help send him to school. And his mom is also working really hard to get him there to do his studies. So he's like not this like bourgeois kid who's like a spoiled rich kid. I think his father's dead, if I remember correctly. He's not this like bourgeois spoiled rich kid going to the city to like party. It's like this is this family's only hope. Like if he can't make it, like the family line is done. They're going to be impoverished forever. So he cooks up this scheme where he's going to achieve greatness and go on to do great things by killing a pawnbroker, because he's studying, all these ideas that I talked about before that the new intelligentsia is introducing from Europe. And the basic concept of utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest many. So he says to himself, well, a pawnbroker is basically a lecherous, useless individual who's not like helping society. But I'm this like upwardly mobile young man who has all this potential ahead of him. And if I am successful at school, I could go on to like, do all these great things to help society. And of course, those great things to help society are exactly what I was talking about before. He could go on to have like real influence with his ideas and his intellect. He could use that to influence the reforms in Russia to make it like a better, more prosperous nation and bring it into modernity. It's exactly what he's trying to do. But, he's in poverty. So his idea is if I kill this lady and rob her and steal her money, I can then like live the high life, and I will be able to like do my studies easily, and I'll go on to be a great man. And Dostoevsky himself was saying, like in his notebooks, this is not in the book itself, that like, well, what if Napoleon wasn't Napoleon? What if Napoleon was just a normal guy in a city, and he saw some potential that was holding him back, and he was never going to be, this great commander. He was just going to be this guy living in this neighborhood in the city that nobody ever knew his name. If that same person saw something holding him back, and that was money, would he kill someone? Would he step over someone and kill them, take their money, and then use it to go accomplish what he wanted to accomplish? And he said, yes, he would. His personality type is such that he would, because he's just a great man. And Raskolnikov has a whole essay about this. He's got a whole essay where he says that like great men who are living in society, uh, you know, according to social mores and according to the values of the day, should not be constrained by those values. They shouldn't be forced to constrain by those values, because if they do have to do the common values of the herd, they're not going to go on to do great things. They're not going to go on to achieve, great reforms, and they're not going to be able to help society. And if they're allowed to be free and flex their muscle and do whatever it is they need to do, they can clear the dross out of the way, and they can go on to build great things that will benefit everyone. It will benefit all of humanity. So his idea is to kill the pawnbroker, steal her money, become this like great intellectual, and implement all this stuff. But it goes horribly wrong. He's too like in his own head. He's too freaked out. He botches the murder. I mean, he kills her, but it's like unnecessarily cruel and grim and brutal because he doesn't know what he's doing, and he forgets to lock the door behind him when he walks in, and the victim's sister walks in, so he has to kill her because she's a witness, and then he has a terrible time. He already has gone in there and scoped the place out, but he's so freaked out in his head that like he bumbles actually robbing her, and he basically just makes off with a purse. Hides the purse. There's like no money in it. It was basically a completely worthless murder for no reason. And he spends the rest of the novel in this like neurotic fugue state, basically like fretting over what he's done and fretting over being caught. So the basic concept here, right? And in his essay, he names a bunch of guys. Like Solon is the only one that comes to my head now, but I had the list here. He names a bunch of people from history. Like, would these people hold themselves back? Did these people think about stepping on little nobodies to accomplish the great things and reform, like historical reforms for society? No, of course they didn't. So I'm not going to do that either. So the idea here, one of the basic, seeds of this idea is that the reason why it's botched and the reason why it goes the way it does, and we should mention he ends up in Siberia. The reason it goes this way is because he's not up to the crime. This isn't his nature. This isn't his personality. He's not a cold-blooded killer, like, by nature. He's never done anything like this. He doesn't come to the city in order to like prey on people and thieve so that he could like enrich himself. He goes to the city to study. That's why he wants to be there. But these ideas get in his head, and he like rationalizes himself into committing this murder. So he's not really up to it. It's not really like who he is as a person. He like uses his intellect to supersede his nature and to supersede his own real proclivities and his own real instincts, to supersede it, to go out and do this. And he totally like botches it. But also, very importantly, all these ideas in this essay he writes, these are like actual ideas that real life people had that were like putting out in pamphlets in the 1860s in Russia. These are the Russian nihilists, and Dostoevsky writes about them again in the book Demons or the Devils, depending on your translation. So he's actually critiquing, and the guy who wrote this stuff, I forget his name now, he's a real guy, was one of the intelligentsia that I was talking about, was putting these ideas out there. They had people listening to them. They had influence. It was a real movement, and people were really taking up these ideas. So Dostoevsky wanted to like show what would happen if these ideas really got accepted by somebody, really got internalized, and really got implemented. Uh, and it's a disaster, and the disaster goes on. I mean, he has this prophetic vision at the end where he realizes like, if everyone does this, if everyone takes up these ideas and decides like, oh, I should step on little inconsequential people to go on and do, my great thing, that will just have complete chaos. And it's this terrible prophetic vision that we could talk about if you want to. But the point is that, of course, like 50 years later, all of these ideas and this nihilism, these nihilists were anarchists. It all culminates, but they were also socialists. These were all socialist ideas as well. Proudhon was a socialist, that a guy I was talking about. This all culminates in the Russian Revolution. And when you read this book with the hindsight of world history, it seems like a chilling prophecy. Go ahead, TR.
So it's the ideas of Europe that get Raskolnikov to actually commit the murder at first, right? He first decides that he wants to murder this pawnbroker because she offers nothing to society, as you say, but he can't go through with it at first. It's only until he meets Marmeladov in the bar, and the original title for this book was The Drunkards, right? And the original story was going to be about this down on his luck drunk Marmeladov, right? And he tells Raskolnikov this story about his daughter, who is forced to prostitute herself, even though she's a believer in God. She tries to be a good person. Uh, Marmeladov, he keeps losing his jobs. Every time that he gets a little bit of money, he just uses it to get drunk. He steals money from his wife, who's dying of tuberculosis. Right? He has all these mouths to feed, and refuses to. Well, not refuses, but he literally can't. It's like uh, one of the best arguments for like alcoholism as a disease, right? That you feel like this guy Marmeladov, the way that he talks, he literally just can't help but fuck up his own life, right? So you have Raskolnikov hearing the story about his beautiful daughter Sonia, who becomes a major player in the novel later on. How she's forced to become a prostitute. One of my favorite parts of this whole story is that as soon as Sonia goes out for her first night, like as a streetwalker, she comes home with money. She just spreads it onto the bed, and the wife Katerina Ivanovna, she just starts kissing Sonia's feet because the family finally has some money coming in, right? Raskolnikov hears this story, right, and he compares it to his own life, right? He sees that his sister, who is marrying this guy Luzhin, who is a brute. It's clear from the letter that his sister sends Raskolnikov that she's only doing this because the family is in such dire straits that they need the money, right? And Raskolnikov is so incensed by his sister prostituting herself, like Sonia prostitutes herself, that he is full of rage, and he goes and he actually commits the murder. And that's but like you said, Astral, he is not the kind of man who can do this. He's just not, and he totally fucks it up. And actually, one of the things that I really love that Dostoevsky does in this novel is, if Raskolnikov would have just left enough alone, everything would have been fine. In fact, every action that Raskolnikov takes ends up blowing up in his face and makes things worse.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought about it that way. If he never did anything, everything probably would have been fine. Yeah. And that's what makes this a tragedy. One of the questions I ask when I talk about tragedies, which isn't that often, but when I do, you have to ask, what's the source of tragedy? Is it the character flaw, or is it the circumstances? And in this case, it is quite clearly the character flaw. His circumstances were not such that he had no choice but to do this, or that if not no choice but to do this, he wasn't like forced into this situation and had to make a terrible choice where he had no good move. He went out of his way to do this. And so what was I going to say? So one of the things at the end, when Raskolnikov like has to confess. Oh, I said that he is in a neurotic fuse throughout the book. So this book is like you're in his head like through the whole thing. It's not first person like Notes from Underground is, but you are hearing Raskolnikov's thoughts through the whole thing, and you're seeing the world through his eyes. And it's like it's actually agony. This is actually like a really difficult book to read, in the sense that it's like very, very stressful. It's like the most stressful book I've ever read. It's not really enjoyable to read, and nothing good happens the whole time. Like nothing good happens. And Raskolnikov isn't really like an admirable figure at all. He's not really like redemptive. Although I guess I've only seen one source that said this, but that this was supposed to be called Crime, Punishment, and Redemption, and that the last third of the novel was supposed to be the whole process of Raskolnikov like reasoning himself into like belief in God, and he like thinks about the whole thing, and comes to like his faith in God, and that's where this all leads him to. But the editor said it was too long, and if you remember, this book was published serially in the newspaper, so it's already like I can't remember, like a 500 or 600 page book. So the editor said it would be too long. So the book was condensed. Excuse me, the third book, the Redemption, Crime, Punishment, and Redemption, was condensed into the epilogue, which is only a few pages long. But and I guess the epilogue has been historically criticized, but I love the epilogue. The epilogue brings the whole thing together for me, because the whole time you're in this agony, And Raskolnikov the whole time is like suffering, and he's like passing out, and he like thinks he has a fever, but he checks his temperature and he doesn't have one. And he's being taken care of by his friends, and he's being taken care of by Sonia, and he's just like this total like fainting, like this sweaty fainting like wreck of a man, because this like destroys him. And interestingly enough, this gets back to like Dostoevsky's experience in Siberia, which I think should be pretty obvious, because when Raskolnikov confesses, he goes to Siberia and he meets all these prisoners. Well, Dostoevsky had the same experience in his life. He was a young intellectual and an author, and he was ascending through the literary scene at the time. And he was like part of this supposedly revolutionary group that wanted to oppose the Tsar, and he got caught and he got sent to Siberia. And like he was this like sort of like meek, like intellectual writer surrounded by all these like hardened criminals. And he started to observe, one of the things he started to observe was that some of the criminals like embodied the criminality, and they didn't really like think about it, and it didn't weigh on their conscience whatsoever, and they didn't really like see being in prison as any sort of like surprise. It was just like that's what their nature was, like that's where they were supposed to be. And when Dostoevsky would ask them questions about it, they would like think he was stupid for like thinking about it so deeply. It's like, no, I'm a murderer. I kill people, and now I'm in prison because that's where murderers go. And these were like the uneducated people. And then he found that the more intellectual people and the more educated people would always either make excuses for themselves, or they would like punish themselves. Their conscience would punish them for what they did, so they'd have a guilty conscience. So the word punishment, and Dostoevsky actually uses that word when writing some notes or maybe writing a letter to his friend about this. And he actually, when he says the word punishment, he's talking about like the psychological torture that you put yourself through if you intellectualize yourself into committing a crime, uh, as opposed to the guy who just does it by his nature. So in the book, this is relevant to the book because the reason why Raskolnikov confesses is because he can't take it anymore. He can't take the psychological torture anymore. So he like relieves himself of the burden of the psychological torture of his crime by confessing and going to prison. And Dostoevsky says in his letters or whatever, or maybe it was his notebook, he says like, there's nothing the state can do to a man like this that is worse than his own conscience. So he's actually like, the punishment is his consciousness, or his conscientiousness, excuse me. And going to prison is actually like a reprieve from it. And that is exactly what Raskolnikov does. And then the other type of character, and I mentioned like French literature, French Romanticism, they were reading the French novels, they were reading the French newspaper. One of the reforms was jury trials, because everything before used to just be done by the czar. And the jury trials like created a lawyer, because the state would like created a class of lawyers, because the state would like bring a case against a suspect, and then somebody would have to argue against the state, so the lawyers would like have at it. And this created like a huge soap opera. So the French press would report this, and like people would read the French press every day about these ongoing like murder trials, and they would be lascivious. Some of them involve sexuality. They would be these raunchy or like violent, crimes that you couldn't get in a novel. And Dostoevsky even wrote somewhere that a murder trial covered in the newspaper is like far more entertaining than any novel ever could be. So like that's what he sets out to do. He sets out to like write a novel that's like following like a murder trial. Yeah, although I should point out they don't actually follow the murder trial in the book. It's like not a scene in the book. They talk about it, and it's important to talk about what they say in the trial, but it's not really like chronicled in the book. Rather, he wanted to depict the actual in real life goings on of the things that the trial talks about in the past tense, if you follow what I'm saying. But I should point out that they do depict the trial in the Brothers Karamazov. And Ivan is the lawyer there. It's a murder trial. So, this is like one of the things Dostoevsky is like really hung up on. So anyway, the other form of rationalization that I was talking about You have the guy like Raskolnikov who his conscience he intellectualizes himself into committing this crime. And then his conscience weighs on him so heavily he tortures himself, which is what this whole book is. This book is mostly just his conscience torturing himself. And anything in this book that isn't that is people like living a living hell, a life of a living hell. I mean, one of the characters goes insane. Someone jumps off a bridge to try to kill herself and all this stuff. One of these murder trials in France, Dostoevsky was really taken by this one character who blamed the murders that he committed on like society and his life circumstances. And he basically said like, "Oh, it's not my fault. Like if I was like born middle class and was like a prosperous man, I wouldn't have had to kill all these people. This never would have happened. This was my life circumstances." Which, by the way, like Dostoevsky, when you read him, he's unequivocally a conservative writer. I mean, it's very obvious that he's conservative. He's explicitly and straightforwardly conservative, and everything he advocates for is conservative. And one of the things that this makes me think of is like nowadays when you have 13% of the population committing 60% of the crime, they themselves, but they're taking up when they say it's like socioeconomic factors, and when they say it's because of the legacy of slavery, they're actually taking up ideas that other people put in their heads. None of them came up with this. This is like white liberals who come up with this, and they make excuses for them, and like they use that as an excuse to like get them off and let them roam society free. That's literally what anarcho-tyranny is. Although that's not in Dostoevsky. Anarcho-tyranny is not part of it. But the point is this whole idea of socioeconomic factors goes all the way back to then. People in trials were blaming socioeconomic factors for their violent crime. And the thing about about Raskolnikov is that when they talk about his trial, they're like, this guy never committed a crime before. He never committed a crime after. He's this meek, well-spoken, like even-tempered, good-natured person. And he got these crazy ideas in his head, and he basically like went insane. So they tried to like throw temporary insanity at him. And the important thing here is that Raskolnikov rejects the temporary insanity plea. He rejects the temporary insanity plea. He says, "I'm not insane. I'm a brilliant intellectual. And this was my idea, and it was a good idea. I just happen to fuck it up. And he also says, like, it's socioeconomic factors. He doesn't use that term, but he like says, like, it's socioeconomic factors that made me do this. If I wasn't in this circumstance, I wouldn't have to do this. And if I wasn't such a fuck up, I would have got it right." And he never like rejects the idea. He just says that like he botched it. He's like, I didn't know that I forgot to lock the door and the sister came in and it threw me off and like I fucked the whole thing up. But if I wasn't such a terrible criminal, I could have pulled this whole thing off. So like he retains the idea, but he says that he personally, it was a lack within himself that makes him to fuck it up. So anyway, I got way off the nihilists here, so I won't go back to the nihilists and belabor them anymore. But I have to make it clear that they were stressing that like you should tear down morality and you should ignore morality and you should actually like commit violence to go like to accomplish your goals. And the nihilist goals weren't what Raskolnikov's goals were. The nihilist goals were like complete social revolution, and they assassinated the czar. They assassinated a bunch of like government people, and they attempted to assassinate a bunch more that they didn't accomplish. And things ramped up worse and worse and worse after Crime and Punishment was published. So like when Dostoevsky was writing this and publishing it, he was saying like this is where these ideas are going to lead. But in reality, the ideas did lead there, and it got worse and worse. And he chronicles some of that in Demons, and then he dies, obviously, but it still continues to like ratchet up, and like everything he predicted came true. So there's a lot more to talk about. I threw a couple things out there that we should elaborate on, but I want to let TR come back.
Oh, definitely. And first thing, if you want to learn more about what prison life in Siberia was like, especially for Dostoevsky, I recommend his novel Notes from a Dead House. Really great story about a nobleman who goes out to Siberia. He's murdered his wife. He kind of does this intellectualizing of She had to die. But throughout the novel, you actually get a more full and complete picture of the men who are prisoners, and there is that divide that because he's a quote unquote gentleman, he's actually treated worse because he should quote unquote know better than these dregs of society who do murder because they're dregs, right? Also, bringing up Brothers Karamazov, actually, Ivan Karamazov has a collection of newspapers, and one of the ways that he tries to convince Alyosha of the non-existence of God is by showing him these French newspapers or these Russian newspapers based on the French newspapers that Astral had brought up. Not really pertinent to Crime and Punishment, but if we're talking about Dostoevsky in general, just really interesting. At least it's interesting to me. You'll also notice throughout Crime and Punishment, every time Raskolnikov does something good, right? He actually he you can see his nature coming out, and it's the parts of the novel that he's not intellectualizing, whether it's after Marmeladov dies and he gives Katerina Ivanovna, his the consumptive wife of the drunk, 25 rubles, and he just does it because the family could obviously use money, right? That pays off a lot of dividends. He actually feels a lot better, and you get a sense at the end of part 2 that he's going to turn his life around, that he's going to be able to bounce back from this. There are several hundred pages later or left in the book, so obviously he doesn't, right? There's also when he confesses to the murder itself, he gets a reduced sentence because and I don't know. I don't know in a historical context if this is something that happened all the time, but one of the reasons that he gets a reduced sentence is because he confessed, and also because somebody else confessed to this murder. I don't know if Dostoevsky's taking this from like actual historical events that happened, or what point he's trying to make there. Astral, you might be able to tell me better on that. The other morally upright thing that Raskolnikov does in this book is something that you wouldn't actually expect. He sabotages his sister's engagement, right? Not only does he write, what's the guy's name? Luzhin, I think. Not only does he write Luzhin like this horrible letter, and basically, fractures whatever chance they have at any sort of relationship, because he knows that this older guy is just preying on a young piece of he's preying on a younger woman, and she's doing this for the money, and he's disgusted by this. So not only does he do that, but when his sister Dunya's her name, when she tries to get the two together to try and reconcile this, and she's like the pinnacle of womanly virtue that Dostoevsky always seems to put in these books. She's trying to keep this family together, this fledgling family together. When she tries to put them back together at this dinner, Raskolnikov actually baits Luzhin into revealing his true character, into revealing what a bastard he is, and she's able to call off the wedding. She later actually marries Raskolnikov's best friend. She lives happily ever after because she has faith, because she is able to overcome maybe her not mental deficits, but she's not as smart as her brother, right? But she does have a good character. Two more things, and then I'll throw it back to Astral. There's also the character of Sonia, right? She is this for Raskolnikov, because when he gets deported to Siberia, he still only believes that his own weakness is the reason that he failed, and that he if he's guilty of anything, he's guilty of weakness. It's Sonia that starts to bring him out of this funk. Astral alluded to this earlier with the crime and punishment and redemption part, where the redemption is only one book or one epilogue long. And then let's talk about another genius, right, who could have pled insanity, who didn't because of the strength of his ideas, and believed that the only thing that he did wrong was get caught. And of course, I allude to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who I know Astral has done a lot of great work on.
Thanks for mentioning that. I have an episode called MK Ultra America, which is, I think, my most popular solo episode. If not my most, it's up there, first or second. You should definitely go check that out. It's all about Ted Kaczynski and the MK Ultra experiment, and a lot more than just the experiment. But while I was reading through Joseph Frank's biography today and yesterday on this, something became very clear to me, and I did a ton of research on Kaczynski, and you can't, like, everything you come across, like, you can't read it all. You have to pick what is pertinent to your topic. So somebody else can go look this up, or maybe I'll go look it up later. I think I remember seeing somebody mention that Kaczynski is like a character out of Dostoevsky. But if I did see that, I didn't dive into it. But as I was reading the last couple days, it became like very, very clear. Because basically the idea here, now this goes back to what I was saying about Raskolnikov in the trial. Because he says, my ideas were good, I just fucked it up. And I didn't implement my idea, if that makes sense to you, right? Like, you could say that, like, on paper, every idea is a good plan, but in practice, it falls apart. But he doesn't accept that, and he doesn't want to plead insanity. He doesn't accept that it like his idea on paper falls apart in reality. He just thinks he did a bad job of it. And he also thought that if he did accomplish it, he still at the end thought that if he, or at least very close to near the end by the trial at least, I think once he actually has his religious conversion, he gets rid of those. He gets rid of that thought. I don't think he thinks that at the very end of the book. Uh, that if he did implement his ideas properly, he would have done a great good for humanity and for history. So therefore, he didn't actually think like killing her was wrong necessarily. But perhaps if he got another chance, he would do something differently. Well, it's the same thing with Ted Kaczynski. His thought was that he would save the environment and he would save the earth and thereby save whatever humans, because he didn't talk about like genocide. Uh, but I think I don't remember him ever talking about like actively like reducing the population of humanity, but by tearing down industrial civilization, obviously, like millions of people would die, and then for in order for like nature, wild nature, because he always used that term, he always said wild nature. In order for wild nature to thrive, you couldn't like have like a growth of human population because they would naturally like encroach upon it. So his idea was that in order to like bring this prosperity to nature and to whatever humans were left at the time, because they would live better like tribal people or whatever. Because he did have this like romantic view of primitive peoples, uh, that whoever he was sending mail bombs to kill, like their lives were like minor and inconsequential in light of like the happiness or the flourishing or whatever word you want to use, the good that he would bring about. And they very staunchly tried to get him to plead insanity, and he just absolutely refused to plead insanity. And the reason he didn't want to plead insanity, he says this explicitly, is because he thought if he did so, it would it would denigrate the ideas. He thought if he pled insanity, it would immediately like inactivate his ideas and make them look ridiculous and make them look like insane ideas. And he didn't want that. He wanted to preserve his ideas as good ideas that he wanted other people to take up. This is important. Like Raskolnikov himself doesn't talk too much about like how everyone should think this way. And in fact, when he finally has his vision of like what was so wrong with his ideas, the very conclusion he comes to is that like if everyone took these ideas up, we would have chaos. But the nihilists, the Russian nihilists in real life, did want everyone to take these ideas up, and they did want everyone to sow anarchy with these ideas. And Ted Kaczynski also wanted that. He also wanted other people to take up his ideas and implement them in the same way he had, and he wanted them to sow anarchy so that they could tear down industrial civilization. So, he's not like exactly like Raskolnikov, but there's very much of it there. And the term that Dostoevsky used, and people use this term for Ahab as well, is monomania. He's got this like monomaniacal like goal of implementing this plan and this idea. And if anybody was a monomaniac in real life, it was definitely Ted Kaczynski. But there was some other stuff you said there too that I wanted to pick up, but I lost it. Oh, all the other threads about Raskolnikov's life and stuff. There's so much stuff to talk about in this book. I mean, we've been going for an hour, and I'm talking about mostly like the broad stuff, but like the plot of the book is really important, and it's really it's a page turner, but it's also like it gives you a fucking headache because, like I said, nothing good happens. But yeah, it should be noted though that what I said about Raskolnikov's conscience, like poisoning him and like tormenting him and making him confess so that he could like alleviate his consciousness or his conscience. It's the same thing with his sister Dunya and her husband. Like, it's the same aspect of his conscience that makes him like put himself in this position in the first place to try to murder this woman because he loves his sister and he's fucking pissed. He's in agony that she's like marrying this like piece of shit that he doesn't respect and he hates and he feels like super guilty and he feels like this super weight and this burden on him and all this pressure. Like, holy shit, my sister is like throwing her life away to marry this guy she doesn't love who's going to be shitty to her and treat her bad. She's doing all that so that I can have the money to go to college. And it like weighs very, very heavily on him. So it's that same character trait of his, right? Where I say this is a tragedy because of a character flaw. The same character flaw and the same character trait that puts him into this neurotic state that causes him to, well, you could even say that it's the character flaw that makes him botch the murder in the first place. But the character flaw that makes him like fret with anxiety throughout the whole book about it so that he finally has to like confess. It's the same character flaw that makes him rationalize himself into the murder in the first place because it's bothering him and burdening him so much that his sister has to marry this guy she doesn't love. And there's a lot to say about Sonia too because there's just so much to say about this novel. But I guess we have a couple more things we talked about getting to before we open up to the audience. But I guess the last thing I'll say is about Sonia. I used to be able to quote this passage from the Bible and tell you where it is in the Bible. I hope somebody in the audience knows. But there's a passage somewhere, I think it's in the Gospel of Mark. It might be in more than one Gospel, where Christ says something to the effect of like a prostitute and a drunkard will get into heaven faster than a tax collector or faster than somebody, faster than another. He gives an example of somebody else. And he says the reason why is because when they hear the word of Christ, they answer it the first time. They don't say why. They don't question it. So the idea here, right, is that like these people are when I talked about the criminal before, this figures very, very heavily in this novel. The end of the novel, the epilogue, where I said the criminal, that's like his nature, and he doesn't have the education. So he doesn't have this intellectual edifice like burdening his brain. This is just how he acts, and he's condemned by society. It's like you don't play by the rules, and you don't embody the morality that you're expected to act upon. In the novel, they are like they scoff at Raskolnikov when they're like, "You are an educated, intellectual, middle-class man. Why are you here? Why did you commit this murder? It's not who you are. This is who we are. This is where we are supposed to be." And then they say something about God, and he says he doesn't believe in God, and they're absolutely aghast. They scoff at him and say, "How can you not believe in God?" So the idea is these people are like closer to God. They have a better relationship. They have a more immediate relationship with God than Raskolnikov does. And the reason why is because of his intellect. The intellect like gets in the way and like poisons him. And that's what he's trying to show with Sonia. Sonia is this like corrupted, literal whore who's like literally physically corrupted, and she's a child, so she's innocent. And it's not her fault that she's in this circumstance, but she's closer to God than Raskolnikov. And she doesn't have all this like intellectual baggage. She just has this immediate relationship with God. And she helps bring him closer to God. And this, I think, is the idea of the Bible passage. Like, these people, like, you condemn them for their actions, but like they're actually closer to God than you are, because when they hear the word of God, they like unhesitantly follow it. They don't question it. They don't think about it, or they don't put their own self into it, their own interpretation on it. Now, the reason why I say this figures so heavily in the novel, it's not just because of the Bible passage. It's not just because of him meeting the criminals, and it's not just because of Sonia. It's because when he has his revelation and when he has his epiphany and he finds God, what he's doing is he's sitting out on the riverbank looking out at the steppe, and he sees far, far away a steppe tribe of people. And he thinks something to himself along the line. I read the passage today. I don't have it handy. But he thinks something along the lines of himself, like, look at those people like living in tune with nature. They're from like a way earlier time in civilizational development, before we came up with all this stuff, before we came up with all these ideas, before we had any ideas of morality, and before we had intellectualism, and before we had academia, and before we had all these ideas, before we intellectualized everything. They were just living these simple lives with this immediate relationship to God, without unmediated by their intellect. So that's when he turns and goes and like falls at Sonia's feet and like has this epiphany, and she falls into his arms. So a lot more to say. I think we should probably draw it to a close, but it's like, I don't know. It's like he falls into the arms of this woman, and I just can't help but make all these parallels to Moby Dick, where Ishmael is like floating in the ocean, everyone's dead, he's about to die, and the ship comes along and it's named Rebecca, and of course Rebecca is like the mother of one of the 12 tribes. There's like all this like biblical imagery of these people like being saved. I mean, it's not a literal woman in Moby Dick, but it's named after a woman from the Bible. And Sonia isn't a literal character in the Bible, but she is like representative of a character in the Bible. And these men who are lost basically and drowning find redemption in the arms of a woman. It's metaphorical in Moby Dick, but I can't help but make the parallels, as well as the fact that Ahab's monomania leads to not only his death and ruin, but the death and ruin of the whole crew, which is exactly what Dostoevsky is saying that this monomania is going to do. It's going to bring ruin to everybody. So that's the basic perception and basic interpretation I have of this novel, without getting way off in the weeds and everything else. But that's everything I think about this novel in a nutshell. So I guess TR, if you want to take it from here, I don't know. We'll open it up to audience at some point, but I want to let TR make sure he gets everything out before we do that.
Thanks, Astral. Just a couple of points, and then yeah, we'll cut off the podcast recording, and we'll get some audience involvement. It's funny. I remember I've told several people this, but if there was a modern Dostoevsky, he'd be writing about incels and e-girls, which I think I know there are a couple guys out there these days who are writing incel fiction, but anyway, just something I thought about. I wanted to bring up also that the relationship between Sonia and the sister of the landlady, Lizaveta, right? The reason so Lizaveta is Sonia's moral compass in a lot of ways. She introduces Sonia to religion, right? Gives her a cross and a copy of the Gospels, right? And she's a simple woman, right? The reason that Dostoevsky is doing this is because he's defeating utilitarianism with the idea of equal moral worth for every human being, right? That God has created everyone, and I mean, like that obviously gets taken out of context and used for all kinds of retardation in today's society. But that Lizaveta and Sonia, even though one is retarded and the other is a prostitute, both have an innate value that Raskolnikov just can't see. With all his education, he is blinded to the innate value of these women, right? So that's an interesting thing to point up. Dunya, who is Raskolnikov's sister, actually she almost commits a murder herself. Right, her brother Raskolnikov is being blackmailed by a man who actually loves Dunya, right? And there's at one point Dunya points a pistol at him, right, and almost shoots him, right, almost committing a murder herself. And it's really good that she doesn't, because life ends up really good for Dunya, and this guy ends up killing himself anyway later because she's rejected him. And it's what Dostoevsky is doing here is there. You could say that in the Christian conception of things, right, God has a plan, right? Dostoevsky is saying that clearly. All the things that happen to the characters who do not commit these mortal sins, right? They end up having happier lives. Dunya, uh, the children of Mermeladov end up going to a good orphanage after the consumptive mother dies. Sonia ends up kind of having a husband in Raskolnikov. It's when mankind kind of takes things into their own hands, into this utilitarian, sort of nihilistic way, like Raskolnikov does, like some of these opportunistic men do, right? Whether it's Luzhin or it's this other guy whose name escapes me. It's Svidrigailov, right? I'm probably butchering that. Oh, sorry, Astro. What did you want
Yeah,
to say?
it's so hard to pronounce Svidrigailov, but is he the one that kills himself? I can't remember. Who's the one that kills himself? Or does he threaten to and he never does? I'm forgetting now. You were talking about it though.
Yeah, it's Svidrigailov who jumps off the bridge, right? Um, anyway, so when there Dostoevsky is clearly saying that there's providence, there is a plan at the end. And one of the weaknesses that people point out about Dostoevsky is that his characters are never quote unquote proven wrong. Ivan Karamazov isn't proven wrong, even though Dostoevsky has to make him crazy at the end. uh, Raskolnikov thinks that the only thing that he's guilty of is weakness, but what Dostoevsky's doing in these stories, right, is they're wrong by everything that happens. Like, you want to live like there is no God and that you can do whatever you want, that you're already on a path of destruction there. That's pretty much all I had. Astral, you can respond to that as you like. And I also know you wanted to talk about Taxi Driver. Um, Again, subscribe to the Double Dealer, subscribe to Astral. We have issue 13 coming out. I'm going to actually end the podcast portion here, and then we can kind of go from there. Astral, unless you have anything else that you want to put on the pod.